Good evening, everyone, and welcome to episode 73 of SCOTONOMICS. Hello, Karen. How are you doing?
I'm good. Yes, all good with me. Busy.
Fantastic. And welcome to everyone who's joining us on our usual channels at YouTube, Facebook, and also on Twitter. Thanks very much for you joining us this evening. Well, we've got a fascinating conversation coming up that I had with Clara Mattei just last week, and it was a really in-depth. I wish we could have done so much longer. We really only covered the aspects of austerity and not how it drives societies towards fascism. There's just so much to cover. We've got a 50-minute episode, 50-minute interview with Clara, so please stay around for that. Karen, any thoughts? How's your week looking? Any thoughts on what happened in Scottish politics and economics last week?
Yeah, so we are trying to put through a deposit return scheme that is being messed around with by the UK government. So they have apparently taken some money from some businesses, and they are not going to agree to recycle glass as part of our deposit return scheme. I'm listening to businesses on Radio Scotland this morning, and the head of the Grocers Federation is saying that the Scottish Government are now going to have to refund them for the machines which are no longer useful because we're not going to recycle glass. So that's a bit of an issue that you could say.
Yeah. It's looking like a huge problem. I think right from the offset, there seem to be significant issues with the plan, but the interference of the UK government just seems to have taken that to a completely new level. And obviously on the much wider political aspects, where it looks like they feel like they're able to interfere with really any decision made by the Scottish Parliament, which is a really worrying, certainly a really interesting step. Over the weekend, Keir Starmer said that a Labour government would not sanction any new oil and gas infrastructure in the UK, which obviously means round about 80 to 90% of that is in Scotland or Scotland's waters. I thought it was absolutely fantastic to hear a mainstream UK-based party say that. I think it was really, really positive. And I wondered what the SNP official policy was on new oil and gas infrastructure, because I couldn't quite track it down. What's your thoughts on that, Kieran?
So I've actually just reposted on my Twitter feed the resolution that was passed at conference. So that's official SNP policy. So if anyone wants to look at my Twitter feed and the replies, they'll see it there. But it was posted originally by Chris Hanlon, who's on the Policy Development Committee. He was the chair of that when I was on it, and he's got that on his feed. So if you're interested in that, that policy is there. It's quite lengthy, so I'm not going to read it out on the show.
Okay, but a summary of that policy?
Well, SNP members, and certainly the ones that voted at conference, are very environmentally friendly minded, I would say. That's the summation of it, I would say.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, what I thought was probably the most interesting aspect for me, having done quite a lot of work on the just transition, was that Scotland and the Scottish government have got these plans for a just transition, and they've taken on the responsibility of delivering this just transition. And I thought, imagine being in that situation where you've taken on all of these responsibilities for a just transition, and as a government, you can't even decide if there's an oil and gas industry in your country. I mean, it makes an absolute mockery of the idea of a Scottish government being able to lead a just transition when a government in Westminster can say, oh, you have an oil industry, or you don't have an oil and gas industry. And this just shows you the kind of inherent weakness in devolution, especially when you've got a government who've making these kind of grand statements without having any of the responsibility or any of the authority to make that.
Or any of the power, and I mean, we on this programme are fundamentally talking about monetary sovereignty, which will lead to fiscal sovereignty, which will lead to a great deal more of political sovereignty, and that's what we want. And there was a young lady grabbed Hamza at the weekend to get his views on this, but I am frustrated that a lot of environmental activists don't seem to understand the difference between what a currency issuer can do and what a currency user can do, and that's what we're trying to educate people about on this programme, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, here's a comment from Hashbury. So that's not reflective of the policy that you were talking about at conference. If Mary has said that, actually, Ash Regan said that it was, and I think I'm quoting directly, environmentally illiterate to consider no new oil and gas infrastructure in Scotland. So I made a comment on that. And she is an MSP. So yeah, I don't think there's much of a clear understanding of the impact the continuation of oil and gas exploration. And as I said in that tweet response to Ash Regan, the International Energy Association have actually said that if we want a pathway to 2050, then there's no space for new oil and gas exploration, and that's the energy International Energy Association. So when they're saying it, I think we really have to question any elected member who is suggesting that we can have new oil and gas infrastructure. Okay, so moving on, I also noticed something last week which literally took my breath away, and this is that the Scottish Government have given councils the ability to have a visitor tax. And they're talking about it being introduced in, wait for it, 2026. And I also had someone contact us from COSLA who said actually they think it might be 2027. I was absolutely blown away by that. And as a little bit of compare and contrast, the Spanish government last month introduced a brand new set of legislation. They've been negotiating it for a year, but they introduced it last month to cap rents and extend the zones where rents were deemed as not sustainable for the people who are living there. It was passed last month and it came into force on Friday. So it took a month from decision to implementation. I'm going to do a little bit more on this because I think it's a really interesting compare and contrast to 3 years, maybe 4 years to 1 month. So I think that just shows what, if you really want to do it, then it can be done.
Can I just also point out that for our viewers and for you, that we have a very limited civil service. So if you're relying on the civil service to do this for you, for example, in Denmark, they've got something like 3 times the size of the civil service that our Scottish government has. So there's that to bear in mind as well. So I don't know the ins and outs of it. I can try to find out more about why that is. But our civil service is very small in comparison to other similarly sized countries.
Yeah, that's a very valid point. Okay, well, we're going to play the video now. Honestly, it was absolutely fascinating, and we've actually invited Clara to come and speak at SCOTONOMICS next year. So hopefully she'll say less. She'll say yes because she's incredibly engaging and interesting. I think you'll love this interview. Enjoy it, and we'll both be back on, I think, at the end of this to say hello. Please do get your thoughts and your questions in as well. Enjoy our interview with Clara, and we'll see you in about 50 minutes. Clara Mattei, thank you very much for joining us on SCOTONOMICS. It's going to be a really interesting conversation around your new book. I know that you're an associate professor in the Economics Department at the New School for Social Research, and we're delighted to have you on to the show today. We're going to talk about your new book, The Capital Order: How Economists Invented Austerity and Paved the Way to Fascism. It looks like to me this book examines the history of austerity and how this policy framework came to have high fashion in the 20th century, including its most powerful expression in the post-war economies of Britain and Italy. I just wondered if you wanted to start with just a general introduction into, in terms of austerity, what impact does it have on an economy and in a society? And is it the same across the globe, or is there different countries who really seem to be attacking this austerity agenda?
Austerity, unfortunately, today is basically synonymous with rational and realistic economic policies. So it's not really easy to detect, but I would say without a doubt that globally speaking, all countries, and I would say the south of the globe, of course, suffers from austerity even more because of the type of constraints southern countries face in terms of the global economy. But I would say without a doubt that austerity is the go-to policies of governments across the globe, and it's so structural to the economy that we barely even see it. We have naturalized as something that we just accept as a given. So before we move on, perhaps it's good to define what we mean by austerity, because the Capital Order, my book, tries to indeed give a framework, provide a novel framework to understand the nature and the logic of austerity. When I speak about austerity, what I mean is a trinity of policies. So fiscal, monetary, and industrial policies that collaborate in unison to shift resources from the majority of working class people towards the minority who make a living out of wealth in forms of interest or rent. So dividends and so on. So what we see here is this trinity operates as fiscal policy, meaning cuts in social expenditures, and regressive taxation, actually taxing the poor in greater proportion than the rich. So consumption tax is a typical one, while usually taxation on corporate profits, on real wealth of all sorts, is diminished. Monetary austerity is what we're seeing everywhere today around the globe, which is increases in interest rate hikes. Dear money, which has the effect of not only making it harder for families to get at the end of the month if they depend on credit, but also that it's slowing down the economy with the effect of actually increasing unemployment, tightening the job market, and thus disciplining workers to accept lower wages. And finally, industrial austerity, which is all of those policies in which the state directly intervenes to curtail the bargaining power of workers, not only attacks on unions, but labor deregulation is a really big one, and of course, privatizations. So this trinity, of course, is also backed by certain theories. And that's why the book looks at the emergence of austerity as this trinity of policies. So this macroeconomic management, the state-led austerity, is backed by many economic experts justifying these policies as the ones that are actually going to better the society as a whole. And what I tried to show is that, actually, going to your question, is that the impact of austerity is actually what can be suspected, which is you see much larger profit shares rather than wage shares, meaning that actually the wealth that society creates goes in the pockets of the very few to the detriment of the many, who are forced to basically relinquish all expectations for greater participation in the economy and accept precarious and low-paying jobs with very little social benefits.
The picture that you paint in the book is that there's a whole framework that's been created around this narrative that austerity is effectively the only way out of the problems that have been created. And unfortunately, certain people have got to pay the price for this for everyone to be better off. Now, when we talk about austerity in the United Kingdom, I would imagine that most people would say austerity started in 2008. Post the great financial crisis, where we had to bail out the banks, which meant the coffers were dry and we ran out of money, and we had to bring in these austerity policies to be able to get the economy back on track. Now, you paint a very different picture in terms of the timeline of austerity, so way before 2008. Would you like to go into a little bit of detail about that for us?
Definitely. So the main thesis of political economy of the Capital Order is that austerity cannot be dismissed as a policy mistake. That actually those economists that portray themselves as critical of austerity often play the game of austerity because understand austerity to be merely an economic issue, to be tackled in a technical terms of whether austerity serves or not to increase growth and pay back the debt. And the theme of the book is actually that that's not at all the lens through which to look at austerity. We need to put the economic with the political and understand that there can be no economic issues that are not deeply also political. And thus we see what is the real purpose and function of austerity, which is that of foreclosing any alternatives to how we run society, protecting the capital order. So the title, the capital order, comes from the fact that capital as wealth, capital as money, capital as GDP growth, presupposes capital as this basic social relation by which the majority of us accepts to go sell one's capacity to work in return for a wage, which is usually a very low one. So capital, our society is based on these social relations. And this is why we need to understand that austerity is there to disempower people materially, but also people in their minds, so that we are trapped into thinking that this is the only possible world. Capitalism is the only game in town. So how do I come out with this thesis? Well, I come out with this thesis by not by like making it up, but by looking at history and by looking at when, and this is why it goes to your question, why we need to go back, not just to 2008 or to Margaret Thatcher, but we need to go back 100 years ago to the Red Biennium, to 1918, 1920, to really understand how austerity emerged as a very powerful counteroffensive to foreclose all of these really interesting, innovative projects for society, practices that had emerged after the First World War. This is why the capital order begins. The first chapter discusses the big, enormous, basically watershed moment that was the Great War. Why? Well, because it was a moment in which the laissez-faire capitalism was shocked at its core, because the state had intervened, had to forcefully intervene because it had no other option. It was a matter of really life or death, victory or defeat. And what happened was that the state was forced to intervene to nationalize production, and especially not only to become the major producer, but also the major employer. So what did this mean? It meant that workers realized very concretely that exploitation, which was very important to keep up during the war in order to produce enough to win against the enemy. This exploitation was not just the outcome of what is called market compulsion, of impersonal market forces that you had to take as a given, as a natural order of things. It became clear with the First World War that our economy was the outcome of a political choice to protect wage relations and private property of the means of production as the main basis of society. And this is where, with the First World War, what I talk about in the first part of the book, which is really, I think, still inspiring for us, is that with the First World War, many, many different experiences and experiments of post-capitalist societies began to emerge. And they were taken very seriously, also by state bureaucrats, because they had a sense by which either we were going to move things forward, or there was just going to be a breakdown of the general consent for the system. This is David Lloyd George, a liberal. He says, national organization and centralized control were found to be more effective than high prices and laissez-faire in stimulating supply. But more than this, there's other quotes that, this is again a British civil servant, Alfred D. Hall. We cannot stand still. We cannot return to the old ways, the old abuses, the old stupidities. The public not only has its conscience aroused and its heart stirred, but also has its mind open and receptive of new ideas to an unprecedented degree. So what I do in the first part of the book is really I highlight and give voice through archival evidence to the spirit of the time, to show how many different alternative society could be out there. And the big main project was the idea of self-governance of labor. So self-management of industry, self-management of agriculture, economic democracy, that would be the foundation for substantial political democracy. So in this moment in which there was a huge demand for economic participation and democratic decision-making over where our resources go. And this was, again, the first time this ever happened, because until that point, capitalism was just anti-democratic, because it had never been the sphere of participation of the working classes. In a moment of enormous political enfranchisement, this is when austerity really is constructed as an intelligent weapon to tell people, no, we're sorry, you got it wrong, you're stupid, you don't understand, you have to step back and let the elites rule once more. And it's here that we really see how the motto, consume less, produce more, which was coined at the conferences of Brussels and Genoa in 1920, 1922, became real, and we still feel it on our skin today, because since that moment, really, the idea that we should live hard, save hard, and what's the other one? And work hard, which were actually words usually used at Brussels in 1920 by the Economists, espousing austerity as this way of really foreclosing all of alternatives to capitalism.
What you're saying is capitalism had been shown to be not the only way that you could run an economy, and that there were better ways of running an economy and benefiting a society. And that was matched at the same time with a wider opportunity for democracy and participation. And that was so dangerous to the capital order that they needed something to kind of quell the masses. And this was austerity. Can you explain how austerity was based on the principle of scarcity, and almost this invention that things are scarce and therefore we must have to create a society where we can only allocate a certain amount of stuff, and that the market has to play a huge role in the allocation of this idea that there's a scarcity, especially on financial resources?
The book looks at what happened in Britain and Italy. And the reason why I decided to take these two countries as kind of starting points was to give this comparative approach that allows us really to see that what was going on in a democratic, supposedly like the cradle of democratic liberalism, and what was happening in the birthplace of fascism. The book talks about what happens under Mussolini's regime in the 1920s. What you see is indeed, curiously enough, and in a way, in a way that is very thought-provoking for us, is that the type of economic policies and the type of rationale, going back to your point, rationale backing these policies was very similar in these supposed very, very different contexts. So liberals and fascists, when it came down to protecting capitalism as the only game in town, used similar tools, both in terms of macroeconomic management, and again, the austerity trinity was really, really powerful, but also in terms of economic doctrines. And here it is where this concept of scarcity, rather than understand it as we need to understand how these concepts that try to look at the economy as a whole, as an aggregate, are meant to conceal, to hide what really is at stake here, which is we are in a capitalist economy, which means that there are winners and there are losers. So these aggregate concepts like scarcity, what's another one? Productivity. We need to understand that these concepts actually imply that certain people will benefit and the majority will lose. So this is really, really important, is that how here what was framed was, of course, we can't do anything else but try to pay back our debt and actually live according to our means. But the reality here is that, and they were very explicit, these economists backing these policies, the reality is that workers have to bear the brunt, have to produce more and consume less. So the narrative of scarcity, which is really not that present actually in my reconstruction, but clearly is there in the sense that the idea is that the reason why we have inflation, for example, and this is, I think, very timely for us today, is that the reason why we have inflation is not due to excessive profit making. It's actually due to the fact that the majority is consuming too much, because wages have gone up too much. So this understanding that there's some constraints, and understanding them as apolitical, as necessary, as natural, is really a way to tell people, well, the natural order of things tells you that you have to sacrifice so that we can live beyond, live within the limits of a capitalist society. And so I think this is really important, is that the same rhetoric that we hear today about inflation, and the fact that then this is clearly, once inflation is due to excessive consumer demand and excessive wages, then of course interest rate hikes appear as the rational, neutral solution, which is what all central banks are doing today. But clearly this hides the understanding that we are blaming the majority for living above their means. So if we frame it differently, we see that these are all very intelligent rhetoric to restabilize money. And this monetary stabilization indeed requires, and this is the whole point here, this is why it's a work based in the tradition of classical political economy dating from Smith, Ricardo, and Marx. This capitalist economy requires the subordination of the majority, not only in accepting wage relations as the basis of our society, something that now we take for granted, but in 1919, people are saying wage relations are done. We want actual self-management of industry, right? So there was a really overcoming of commodification of labor for the society to come. Not only people have to accept wage relations, but people also have to accept very low wages. And this is the precondition for monetary stability. And this we're seeing very clearly now in the United States, is that in a moment in which with the COVID stimulus, people have actually been quitting their jobs. The Great Resignation in the United States is a really real phenomenon. 46 million people left their job in 2022, similar numbers in 2021. The labor market is tight. Nominal wages are going up. Strikes are happening. Unions are gaining momentum in the service sector. This is the right moment for the Fed, Jerome Powell, the Fed Chair Jerome Powell, to strike with monetary austerity. Again, with the idea that we are even willing to accept a recession, something that, by the way, happened in 1920s in Britain. You accept the fact that this will cause a momentary downturn. But ultimately, you also guarantee the foundation of it all, which is the fact that people will be disciplined by the unemployment mechanism and will have to be forced back to work. So what I show is that in the 1920s, if you look at the data, and this I depict actually pretty in detail in chapter 9 with a lot of empirical data, I show how once your money hit in the 1921 in Britain, unemployment started skyrocketing, union membership dropped, strike dropped, and then you look at the wage share and the profit share, meaning what goes to wages and what goes to profits, we have a reversal. While wage share was going up immediately after the war, in a matter of a couple of years, the slowing down of the economy refurbished the fundamentals for the profit rate to pick up again. So this is all to say that we need to make sure that when we look at economic models and look at the type of policies these models justify and propel, we need to keep the class dimension in mind. And this is kind of really the foundation of the argument of the book.
Which is incredibly strong. But before we look at those policies, and you know, I love this idea of the Trinity, you know, the discipline through fiscal, monetary, and industrial. I think that's really, really powerful. In the book, you talk about the kind of stated goals, and we mentioned this quite a lot on Scotonomics. That, for example, the stated goals of privatization was efficiency. And that was the narrative, but it was clear when you look at it, underlying it wasn't. It was just an extension of the capture of the commons. It was more wealth for a select few and taking it from the many. And that seems to be a kind of constant narrative that goes through this this idea of austerity. So when we're looking back to the 20s and right up to the 2020s, what was the stated goal of austerity, and what do you think were the real reasons for austerity?
The stated goal of austerity was, as you point out, efficiency, prudence, market stabilization. Now, what's interesting here is that while right now we are in a condition to basically swallow these ideas as scientific, what was happening after the First World War was a moment in which economic experts who were just emerging with what is dominant as a paradigm today, right? So neoclassical economics as we know it has not been there forever. And actually in the 1920s, it was only just really diffusing as the new mainstream, and had to supplant a tradition that was indeed much more based on conflict and on classes, and thus on the fact that if some gain, others lose, with instead a paradigm that was all about individuals, all about harmony, and all about the fact that if the entrepreneur, saver entrepreneurs makes it, this is going to be to the benefit of everyone else, right? So in this sense, this type of framework was really not accepted by the general public at large, because actually it had been clear, for example, that collectivization of resources and central planning had been the way to win the war and were much more efficient. So you see, what's interesting here is that while for us, we equate privatization with efficiency, in the time I look at, this was not at all any more accepted. And actually the bureaucrats themselves, the bourgeoisie, had kind of given up on the idea that the invisible hand was actually superior to public ownership and public management. So it's here that you need an extra effort from the part of the models and the theory to convince people that actually no, privatization equates to efficiency. And I think, though, what was also clear at that time that makes it, that's why, again, looking at history can help better understand the present, is also because at the time it was very obvious to these economists, and I have protagonists in my book. I talk about specifically those marginalist economists who were working for Benito Mussolini in Italy, and those economists running the Treasury and the Bank of England in Britain, especially someone like Ralph Hawtrey. These economists made it much more clear than it is normally is today, even if things are changing, I think, that more than efficiency, privatization was really about disciplining workers by providing greater market dependence. So this is what austerity was about increasing market dependence of the majority, right? So you privatize, this means, and they say it very explicitly, you need to get rid of public jobs, because public employees are much more seeking of their rights, because they are immediately confronting the political. They're immediately being employed by the political actor, and thus they understand that they can have a political confrontation for a betterment of their condition. Now, instead, privatization is all about reintroducing the force of impersonal supply and demand and disempowering the worker. And this also puts workers in competition with one another,
which of course had been happening in the UK for centuries through the capturing of the commons.
Absolutely.
A kind of government extension, a central government extension on that.
That's exactly it. I think this is exactly the point, is that capitalism works because we become market dependent, and society at large becomes market dependent, both workers and capitalists, by the way. And this is, of course, once more, not natural, is the outcome of the enclosures of the commons, the primitive accumulation that happens from the very birth of capitalism in the 14, 15, 1600s. Now, what austerity is all about is about the state. And by the way, primitive accumulation was already state intervention, right? So we are talking here about the fact that there's no market without the state. And this is an intuition that, if you look at history, only economic textbooks can make you think otherwise. But any historian knows that you can't have markets without the state. But here what happens is that austerity intervenes, especially in moments of greater questioning of this market dependence. So when market dependence is for some reason disrupted, and this gives political space, opens political imagination for alternatives, this is when austerity needs to hit again. And privatization is a key element, because with the rhetoric of efficiency, which is a rhetoric, by the way, that you really need to convince people about, given that they don't buy it anymore, you also are telling the people the reason why we need to privatize is because this efficiency, and this is why it's so interesting to look at this point, this efficiency only comes if we subdue the workers. So this is something that at the time economic expert had really clear in mind. And I just wanted to give you a sense, Montagu Norman of the Bank of England, who's considered, the emblem of liberalism, was looking at what's happening in Italy, was seeing that Italy had been a country that was actually propelling workers' councils and the possibility of actually breaking away from the capital order. And he says it very clearly, like Mussolini was the right man because he was able to provide this efficiency, which was really all about subduing workers. So he says, this is a letter I found at the Bank of England archives. And he was writing to Jack Morgan of JP Morgan Chase, who was a big supporter of Mussolini. I was actually paying a lot of money to the Duce early on. He says, this is Montagu Norman of the Bank of England in 1926. So the regime has already shown its brutal face of beating, torturing, and killing opposition. He says, so I read, even Montagu Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, who expressed wariness of the fact that under fascism, anything in the way of otherness was eliminated and opposition in any form was gone, added in the same breath, this state of affairs is suitable at present and may provide for the moment the administration best adapted for Italy. He continued, fascism has surely brought order out of chaos over the last few years. Something of the kind was no doubt needed if the pendulum was not to swing too far in quite the other direction. The Duce was the right man at a critical moment. And if you read the dispatches of the ambassador, British ambassador in Rome, he says it clearly. He says, it is now generally admitted, even by those who dislike fascism and deplore its method, that the whole situation has changed. A striking progress towards the stabilization of state finances. See, like the image of the good of the whole. Strikes decreased by 90% and working days lost by over 97%. And an increase in national saving by over 4,000 lira. So here you see the sense that efficiency comes from reestablishing the capital order. And thus you need to make sure that strikes stop, that workers stop demanding too much, and that the profit motive is protected. So again, I think it is in this moment that these rhetoric, this jargon of the good of the whole, the efficiency, the productivity, as if these are objective measures out there that we should just accept, are clearly based on an incredibly classist understanding of society. And the economists at the time I analyze make it very palpable.
And you can see the same, I mean, you're telling a story about eminent economists who are going to a very authoritarian state and saying, hey, they're doing really well, we should be thinking about those policies. And if you fast forward 50 years, you've got Milton Friedman, who is really in favor of how Hong Kong is being managed, and obviously his work in Chile in the 70s. It's a very similar situation where capitalism can thrive in authoritarian regimes. And you've got in your book a wonderful phrase which you said that austerity is capitalism's protector, and I thought that was really powerful. And you'd said in our interview so far that it kind of drops in and out to protect capitalism when it seems to be teetering. Do you have a feeling that capitalism is, again, I think from your book, one kind of shoulder shove away from falling over the cliff edge right now?
I do think that what history reminds us about is that capital is not a fixed given. It's a social relation, and it constantly needs protection. So in certain historical moment, it needs more protection than other moments. And again, the problem here is not just that capitalism is not compatible with parliamentary democracy in many cases. And this is a story, of course, some like Quinn Slobodian tells, and I guess you're referencing also to his work here. Is more than that, is that ultimately capitalism is not really compatible with democracy in a more structural sense of participating together in economic decision making, right? And I think right now we are in a moment that is definitely not as revolutionary as 100 years ago, but I do think that there is a fundamental questioning of the foundations of our society as based on exploited labor. And in the United States, this is quite real. It is real enough to get the Fed worried and acting on it with interest rate hikes. Now, I think this is a really big intuition for the left as well. The left has internalized the idea of the end of history and capitalism as the only game in town way more than the protectors of capitalism have. So this, I think, is a lesson of also optimism. And this is like how I end my book, is like, you know, austerity is the outcome of collective decision making. It is the outcome of collective action to foreclose any alternatives to capitalism. It can thus be subverted through collective counteraction. The study of its logic and purpose is a first step in that direction. So this collective counteraction is what is really worrying the governments right now. And I think it is the case that one doesn't want to be overly optimistic about the thrust for change available at this moment, but I definitely would like to point out that this is why we need to be doing political economy, to understand that any economic problem is deeply a political problem, and thus this need to kind of make sure that people don't get strange ideas about how to regain self-sufficiency, for example, and find ways to actually breach away from market dependence, which would really be what would open up spaces for alternatives, is forgone. Now, I just wanted to mention this point as well, is that this is, of course, a temporal argument we're making here. So in moments of greater social upheaval, then austerity steps in. And this has been very clear, for example, in the time I look at, so early 1920s, but it was very clear also at the end of the 70s, another moment in which indeed wage relations were being contested in Italy and in Britain as well. Strikes were also about self-governments of industry in that time. And then we know that then we see the wave of austerity of what people usually refer to, right, the 80s of Thatcher, Reagan, etc. But, you know, in 2008, for example, perhaps there was less of an upheaval. Yet I think austerity still serves the same purpose, because it's not just a temporal argument we're making. And of course, in certain moments, again, you see it very easily how this is a reaction. It's also a structural argument in the sense that ultimately the capital order needs constantly to have people disempowered. So the fact that you reinforce market dependence through fiscal, monetary, industrial austerity, and you shift resources away from people. You make sure, for example, that you cut social benefits. Why? Well, if you cut social benefits, people will be forced to have more money in their pockets to pay for education and health, for example. And this means that they will be dependent on going to sell their capacity to work in return for a wage, much more. And we can go on and on. So this, I think, is something that is required in general for capitalism to function. And this is why in my second book, I'm going to be looking at critically at the supposed golden age, which is a moment in which people think that we could have had capitalism without austerity. Here, the argument is a little bit, austerity is kind of like the foundation of the very capitalism, because you need to make sure people don't have any way out, both mentally and materially speaking. So that's why I think also right now, all the wins of the far right are ultimately the expression of the success of austerity. Austerity has succeeded so much in disempowering us and killing class awareness and killing the capacity and the time for people to actually get together and organize politically. People have lost an idea of what it even means to collectively make decisions, to actually have the time to decide on how to run resources of society, which are our resources. so that ultimately you just give up either to the technocrats. And this is, again, a big point of austerity, is how you de-democratize decision-making. And for example, central bank independence is a very important way in which you de-democratize. And this is a very important kernel of austerity, is that in Italy, you had fascism and a dictatorship. In Britain, you made sure that the Bank of England was not nationalized and monetary policies were just in the hands of the economic experts, right? So it's a different way to de-democratize, but this is what austerity does. And I think right now what we're seeing about the fact that people are very upset and vote the far right is the outcome of the fact that austerity has worked really to disempower us to the point that we just give up our agency, our economic and political agency, and hope that someone else will take care of it. And of course, that is the moments in which it is very easy then to have people get upset with the weaker members of society instead of seeing the real problem, which is the structural subordination to the elite that ultimately are the only ones benefiting from the system right now.
And we spoke about capitalism there, and you said that it can't operate within democracy. Well, I would say it can't in any way operate within the idea of planetary boundaries. Do you feel that this is, again, something else that's pushing against capitalism and maybe driving a lot of countries towards this idea that they need the protector of austerity?
Yes, I think we are in a moment, you're right, in which not only the two real predicaments of this moment are the devastating inequality crisis, people are seeing this, I think, more and more, and the devastating climate crisis. And both crises, I think, are really challenging the dominant austerity ideology and are showing how we are really not in the best and only possible system. And it is here that I think the capital order, my book, can serve in two ways. One is to give us some antibodies, in the sense that it's clear from history and from the story I tell that the fact that now the state wants to do ecological investment is not the solution to the problem, specifically how this ecological investment is happening, because it's happening through private-public partnerships and through the fundamental de-risking of big asset managers who are actually taking on the infrastructure project, which is the complete paradox, because the short-termism of these big speculators is exactly antithetical to the issue we are confronting right now, which is the climate catastrophe, which needs necessary long-term vision and breaking away from the profit motive to even be possible to grapple with, if at all, right? So I think it's very important to read this book to realize that it's not either austerity or state intervention, but actually how the state and the market are allied against the people, and the state operates fundamentally to protect capital. So this is the first thing that we should understand, is that the Green New Deal as an alternative needs to be rethought. Is it really an alternative? And ultimately, what is, for example, the Biden administration doing right now to confront capitalism, the climate catastrophe? And clearly, it's doing stuff that are completely within the logic of austerity, because it's only incentivizing private investors without really trying to question the foundations of why everything is going to hell. And at this point, I would also say that, so this is the antibodies that you can get from understanding austerity, is understanding the limits of our system, and including why we can't be within the system if we want to confront these enormous real issues that are emerging. The second is, yes, I think it also to show that I think right now we are in a moment that people are realizing how the system as a whole is incompatible with our survival as a human species. And so I think it is in this moment that we realize that either one moves forward with new ideas about how to organize production and distribution that are not exploitative and extractive. And here it is where I think the first part of the book can also help think about what the story can teach us about potential new imagination. But at the same time, again, be aware that there is a reaction to breaking away, because breaking away scares those who benefit from a system that is, though, a system that is suicidal. And this is where I think the majority has to take back decision-making in their own hands. But of course, as you were pointing out, this is not immediate, because austerity is so structural that it takes away decision-making authority from us without us even realizing it. Right now, for us, it's absolutely normal to have no say on monetary issue, no say about where the money that we have that comes from our taxes goes. We are just like, rearming Europe with the risk of a nuclear disaster, and people are just accepting it because they don't understand that actually those could be decisions that we as people running the economy should be making. And this is where I think we need to really use the opportunity that history gives us to realize that actually, even if economic models tell us that it's the saver investor who runs the economic machine, we should be thinking, no, it's actually workers who are the source of value, and as such should be also the source of political decision, of a collective decision that could have us escape this methodological individualism that is imposed on us and that is ultimately leading to a climate catastrophe.
What is that model, and how do we go about reframing it? Because I think one thing I've taken away from this discussion is this idea of the real goals. And I think at the end of your book, when I hopefully get to at the end of this week, really clear, it says that if people are aware of what the real goals are, the real goals of austerity, we're in a much better position to act against that. So what do you think the economic model that we've got says about the economy that we have, and how can we counteract that narrative?
Yeah, I mean, this is the whole point. We economists use economic models, and the majority of economists, if one studies micro and macro at school, use economic models that don't even discuss capitalism, right? It's models that have completely disembedded the market from any social relation and don't understand that actually our economy is not an object separate from us, but it's actually us in relations, and this is how the economy is structured. So if models don't discuss capitalism, it's because they're naturalizing capitalism. They're taking for granted the fundamentals. Wage relations, private property of the means of production, which are the pillars of capitalism, are just assumed and ultimately assumed away, right? Because once you don't, whatever you don't talk about is what is ultimately you're taking for granted, and thus not problematizing, right? So these are the type of models that circulate today, which are, again, models that tend to see basically capital as deserving its returns because capital is participating as the fundamental input in the production function. And you see here where the problem lies is that this is an understanding that capital is an input that derives out of this individual, and again, this is not discussed, but this is the assumption, the individual virtuosity of the saver investor in its capacity to abstain, save, and thus contribute to production through capital. And this is something that, again, is a theoretical construction that emerges explicitly against another conception which actually put the worker at the center of stage. So this is Luigi Einaudi. He's one of still today the most important economists in Italy. Founded the Bocconi University, was our first president of the Republic after the fall of Benito Mussolini, and then you find out by looking at history is that in the 1920s, he was a massive supporter of Mussolini's austerity agenda. But not only, he was also battling for new models to take over, right? Models that are the ones that we still today use. And he was writing, in 1920, Luigi Einaudi wrote a polemic in the liberal newspaper Corriere della Sera, bemoaning Marxist economists as their labor theory of value. Why should a capitalist profit only because the machine is his? Why shall he live without doing anything? It is not obvious that his profit comes from the exploitation of someone else's labor, he asked sarcastically. This is the celebrated and vulgar sophism of Marxist capital. But it is enough to ask, how much would be produced if the savers did not produce capital? The answer, nothing. Without capital, labor produces zero. You see the inversion, the conceptual inversion. Capital not as ultimately dead labor and ultimately the outcome of, yes, unpaid labor, but capital as the outcome of the individual's moral capacities. And so at this point, it's clear that those who have capital deserve to have capital, and not only deserve to have capital, they are also those who we should all think, because thanks to that capital, you're also generously employing workers who are now in the models considered only really kind of passive secondary inputs, who really only have the capacity to choose between one work or another, between leisure and labor, but don't have any other agency in the process. So again, I think the very way in which people study economics is really a way to kill the political, to depoliticize, and ultimately trap our minds.
Austerity frames the types of inputs that go into the policy framework, which means that only certain policies come out the other side, and we have to do much more as a society to reshape the things that are considered important, the things that go into these models, so that the different policy and different policy frameworks can come out.
That is the most important message, is that to re-empower ourselves, we not only need to debunk capitalist institutions, we also need to debunk mainstream worldviews, because ultimately it is the lens that we wear to actually look at the world that either that can kill our capacity to think forward, or can really gives us emancipatory potential. And that's why actually going back to some of Gramsci's works, which is what I tried to do in chapter 4, is really important, because he really tells us that in his understanding of praxis, you cannot think differently if you're not acting differently. And you can really only act differently if you have theory that propels this action forward. So this is really important, is to understand that we need new ways of looking at the world, but we can do this if we participate actively in order to actually gain the insights that comes out of confronting ourselves with the deep problems that society faces, and to not doing it in an armchair. Like, that's, economists are structurally conservative because the majority of them live in places like Princeton and Yale in beautiful houses in the middle of the forest and have no idea how society works. You cannot be someone with original and powerful messages if you're structurally detached from the problems of capitalism. This is why theory has to come from people, and we need to also stop the idea that, like, this idea that academics hold the knowledge in their hands and can exclude everyone else, because this is part of what austerity does, is create this idea that there's like the cast of people who know, and the rest has to just accept. And this is really something that you see from this story I tell, how once more, this was an effort that keeps going on by the fact that you should exclude people because they don't have a PhD in economics. Now we need to have the courage to actually gain back the power in our own hands, to think critically and to act critically, and to realize that action and thought are really all in one. And that's why I think intellectuals who want to participate need to really be public intellectuals and take some causes and work with others and stop thinking they're superior because they have a fancy salary in a fancy institution. We should be wary of those who propel austerity, but also be aware of those who just think austerity is a policy mistake that we can just dismiss, and have capitalism without austerity, and have a capitalism that is humane, is environmental, and all this. I think there's an issue here because we need to stop idealizing our socioeconomic system. We need to understand both theoretically and historically how it works. And again, you cannot have theory without history, and you need theory to understand history. And then once you really understand the logic of capitalism and how it operates and how austerity is structural to it, this is really important in order to build an actual alternative that knows what it's fighting against. And I guess what you guys are doing seems exactly what needs to be done in this direction. And I would just like to close by saying, any economist that tells you that what he's doing is only technical, not political, this is a contradiction in terms. And this is what you will learn from my book, is how this has actually been, this professionalization, depoliticization of the science has been an active choice that took many years to get institutionalized. But if you see how it emerged in a moment of enormous class conflict, economists were actually participating in class warfare after the First World War, then I think this can really help us understand how those claims are claims that should be kind of critically addressed.
I would love to finish by saying we'll make the book, the Scotonomics Book of the Month, in August, so we can encourage more people to read it, because it's fascinating, and I really appreciate the time you've been able to spend with us, Clara. Thanks so much. I've learned a lot, as always, on our interview, so thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much.
I can't hear you.
There you are. There I am. There I am. I hope everyone enjoyed that. I'm a little bit further through Clara's book, and we have made it Book of the Month, which we're going to do in August. I think I said in that video, either August or September. It's fascinating. Karen, what did you think of our interview?
Yeah, I think a really important thing, that I think it was actually you that said it, not her, but the system is incompatible with our survival as a species. You know, that's the bottom line, really. It's both not compatible with democracy and planetary boundaries. And can I encourage people to have a wee look at my feed on Twitter today? I found a really great video of Extinction Rebellion in the Netherlands, who were being water cannoned, but they were actually dancing in the water. So it didn't really work as a form of, to try and stop them from demonstrating.
We covered it as we always do. Really, we covered the climate crisis in that interview as well. But yeah, it was a really important point. I think to make. Capitalism seems like it worked and needed a huge amount of support to make it work, and those systems of support, democracy, and the need to solve the climate crisis just cannot underpin that form of economy anymore. And I think that's becoming clearer and clearer. Fascinating book, and I can't wait to get into all the stuff about how it pushed towards fascism as well, because I think that's really pertinent for what's happening in some various countries at the moment.
Yeah, and I think, you know, if you're a working class person, a lot of this stuff is quite instinctive as well. You know it's going on. I think what Clara does is she really intellectualizes it very succinctly. It's you know, you can see it's going on, and it's what we do about it that matters.
Absolutely. And, you know, I think as Clara said there, you know, for over 100 years, economists have built this wall between capital and the public, and austerity is a huge part of it. And as soon as we start dismantling that, we actually see how weak the foundations of capitalism are. And they're not standing behind a wall. They're actually cowering behind it, you know. And I think books like Clara has written, and hopefully what we're doing on the show helps dismantle that. It's a wonderful interview, and hopefully we're going to get, as I said, we're going to get Clara to Scotonomics. Now, I know there was a lot of chat about the deposit return scheme. A couple of people said, sorry, we didn't really watch that interview. So I do encourage you to go back and watch it again. It's a fascinating conversation. It's not something I've been particularly involved or engaged with, but there seems like a lot of really good ideas and thoughts in that chat. So thanks everyone for joining us tonight. In a couple of weeks' time, we're back every second Monday. We've got an amazing interview with Bob Hockett. We showed a little clip, which is on our Scotonomics page at the moment, about his thoughts on the debt ceiling in the US, and he was, of course, proved to be correct. It's a fascinating conversation. We just said to him, if you were advising the Scottish government, what would you do with financial services and what would you do with corporate governance? And we kind of started there, but we covered a huge range of things, as you would expect if anyone knows anything about Bob. Fascinating interview. We'll have an extended version on the Patreon tomorrow, and then we'll be live for everyone else in a couple of weeks' time. On Wednesday, we've got a live Q&A, and we're going to be discussing our 3 articles that we'll have done for the National. So if you can join us at 2:30 BST on Wednesday, we'll answer some questions, and we'll talk a little bit more about this kind of pre-analytical vision of the economy, why we need to degrow and move to a steady state economy, and also the article that's out tomorrow, which is about where does all the money come from, and this idea of free money and the idea of the government actually spending to create money. So 3 really interesting topics. I hope you can read them on the National newsletter and chat about them with us on Tuesday. Thanks so much for joining us. And if we can't see you on, sorry, not on Tuesday, on Wednesday, if we can't see you on Wednesday, we'll see you in the next episode of SCOTONOMICS. Thanks so much for your time. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.